Welcome to the Harold Bealey Library's House of Learning Lecture Series. I'm Mike Hunter, the coordinator for this year's lecture series. In the Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verse 119, it says, "Organize yourselves and establish a house, even a house of faith, a house of learning." Through this lecture series, the Harold Bealey Library is attempting to establish a house of learning by bringing students and scholars together for a discussion of ideas. We are privileged to have as our featured speaker today Professor David C. Dollahite from BYU School of Family Life, where he is an Eliza R. Snow University Fellow and has served as an Associate Director of the School of Family Life. Professor Dollahite obtained a bachelor's degree in family life and a master's degree in marriage and family therapy from BYU and a doctorate in family studies from the University of Minnesota. His scholarship focuses on religion and family life in the Abrahamic faiths, Latter-day Saint family life, and faith and fathering. He has interviewed nearly 150 parents and 77 adolescents from various Christian, Jewish, and Muslim families in New England, Northern California, and Utah about the connections between their faith and family life. He has published over 50 scholarly articles and chapters and has edited 4 books, including 2 on LDS family life, Helping and Healing Our Families, and Strengthening Our Families. Professor Dollahite's lecture today is entitled, How the Abrahamic Faiths Bless All the Families of the Earth. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Dollahite.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, friends, for coming. I look forward to chatting with you about this interesting topic about how the faiths of Abraham, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, have blessed their own families and many other families throughout the earth. God makes many promises to the faithful. I've just listed a couple of them here. Jesus said, "If you keep my commandments, you shall abide in my love." The Lord said to the Nephites, "Inasmuch as you shall keep my commandments, you shall prosper in the land." And in our own dispensation, the Lord, speaking and revealing the word of wisdom, promised that those who kept the principles that were taught in section 89 of the Doctrine and Covenants, quote, "And I, the Lord, give unto them a promise that the destroying angel shall pass by them as the children of Israel and not slay them." So this is one of those interesting promises that the Lord gave, and the saints, before any scientific evidence was available about the negative effects of alcohol and tobacco and other harmful substances, the saints who faithfully live this principle have been greatly blessed. And now a number of research studies done by good scholars in epidemiology and other fields have found that, for example, Latter-day Saints who live the word of wisdom live many years longer on average than other Americans. And so there's been empirical proof, so to speak, of that particular promise from the Lord. I'm going to focus today on a particular promise that God gave to his servant Abraham. In Genesis, the Lord made a promise about blessings that he would give Abraham, and also how Abraham's seed would be a blessing to others. Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, "I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." And later in Genesis, the Lord reiterated that promise and said, among other things, "And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." The Lord also repeated that promise in our own dispensation, while it's available in the book of Abraham, the Pearl of Great Price, revealed through the prophet Joseph in the book of Abraham, where it says, "And in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." So the Lord is promising not only to bless Abraham and his seed, but that through his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed. What's the seed of Abraham? Typically, the so-called Abrahamic faiths include Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And for those who consider Mormonism to be As Rodney Stark, a very well-known sociologist of religion, said, that Mormonism is a new world faith, and it's distinct from traditional Christianity as Judaism is and Islam is from Christianity. So I think Latter-day Saints certainly consider themselves the seed of Abraham, and many promised blessings that we receive through the scriptures and in the temples talk about that. The Abrahamic faiths together include about half of the people on the earth, almost 4 billion people. There are very important similarities amongst the three Abrahamic faiths. There are also some very important differences. They are all monotheistic. They all look to Abraham as their spiritual father. They all look to Jerusalem as a holy city. And they all have a prophetic tradition. There are also, of course, some important differences, and there have unfortunately been quite a bit of conflicts between these three faiths over the years. But all look to Father Abraham as the father of the faithful. Relative to most other world faiths, the Abrahamic faiths are highly familially oriented. Quite a bit of emphasis on marriage and family, beliefs and practices. This particular presentation focuses on how the Abrahamic faiths have blessed families, their own families that are members of those faiths as well as others. I mentioned Rodney Stark. He's written a number of very interesting books about monotheism and sort of the benefits to the world that have derived from monotheism, meaning the three Western monotheistic faiths of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. He claims in a couple of books, One True God and For the Glory of God, that monotheism has brought a number of benefits to the world, including the end of slavery in the West, freedom and democracy, Western civilization, a commitment to reason, worldwide emphasis on charity and education and health, and a number of other things. Also Rodney Stark, and another book that he wrote, summarized very briefly, and I'll go into some of this research in a little bit more detail in just a minute, but he summarized the social science research that's been done on the benefits and effects of religion. Quote, "Religion has a substantial independent impact on marriage, divorce, fertility, educational attainment, infidelity, crime, drug and alcohol consumption, to name but a few areas," and there are many others. There's an entire very thick encyclopedia of health and religion documenting hundreds of studies, actually thousands of studies, showing the benefits of people's religious involvement to their physical and mental health. There's been quite a bit of research also done in the family area, which I'll talk about a little more in just a minute. There's a new movement in the last couple decades in America, particularly picking up steam the last decade, called New Atheism, which is a group of folks who are very upset about religion, and I'm just quoting a couple of sentences from the New Atheism website, where they say that their mission is, and their emphasis is, intolerance of ignorance, myth and superstition, disregard for the tolerance of religion, indoctrination of logic, reason, and the advancement of a naturalistic worldview. New Atheism has been called, quote, a more aggressive, often belittling posture toward religious believers. One of their leaders, Christopher Hitchens, said in a recent article that was published by the NPR, religion is, quote, sinister, dangerous, and ridiculous. So there's this new effort to not only disregard religion, but to mock it and to belittle it and to try to remove it as much as possible from the public sphere. The issue is that the research, the empirical research done by hundreds of good social scientists has shown that in fact religion has many demonstrable benefits. And of course, religion has caused some problems. Religious conflict remains a very serious issue. Religious extremism, religious violence is a serious issue. But for the vast majority of people who are living their faith day to day, it turns out that the research is overwhelming that their families and their marriages are benefited by their involvement in their faith. So yeah, religion can both harm and benefit marriage and family life. Not all ways of being religious are healthy, but most research indicates that religion is quite beneficial. So in sum, religion is a potent force for good and bad, but again, the overwhelming preponderance of the research shows that religion is an effect for good in the vast majority of people's lives. The research that I do and that others have done focuses on, there's a number of ways you can study religion. Our approach tends to focus on three major areas: spiritual beliefs, doctrines, principles, and meanings; religious practices, the rituals and traditions and observances and prohibitions that religions ask of their adherents; and then the faith community, the social support, the leadership, the mentoring that goes on in faith communities. I want to just mention briefly a little bit more about each of those three areas. And in particular, the Abrahamic faiths have teachings and practices that involve these types of things, and research has shown that these things are beneficial for families. The sanctification of marriage and family. The Abrahamic faiths say that marriage and family is a holy thing and is ordained of God. Fidelity to marital vows is emphasized. Love and devotion toward children, respect for parents and grandparents, belief in marriage as a lifetime, or in some cases eternal, covenant relationship, valuing generational bonds and valuing repentance and forgiveness, which turns out is very important in marriage relationships, as people do end up sometimes offending and hurting each other, and without repentance and forgiveness, family relationships don't tend to do real well. There's been research on various religious practices. Overwhelming research shows that families that attend religious services together, particularly more than once a week. I mean, once a week is very important, but those who attend services more than once a week are especially well off and better off than those who don't attend religious services on a variety of issues that I'll mention. Personal couple and family prayer are enjoined, couple and family scripture study, prescriptions against the abuse and use of alcohol and other substances, and serving others. All these things are encouraged by the Abrahamic faith, and they've been shown to be beneficial for families. Faith communities, it turns out, provide their adherents a number of benefits: social support in tough times, mentors for children and youth, various groups, a place to serve, a sense of identity for young people, presence of strong and available male role models, and a place where women and mothers feel respected and valued. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are faith communities that don't practice and believe those kinds of things, but by and large, the Abrahamic faith communities do. In a nutshell, a very large body of research has found that there is a positive relationship between religiosity, involvement in a religious community, and practicing one's faith, and these types of things: marital commitment, marital satisfaction and functioning, marital stability, marital fidelity, marital conflict resolution, parental function, parental warmth, family centeredness, lower rates of domestic violence, and the list really does go on and on. I could have 2 or 3 more slides showing these things. One well-known recent book, Soul Searching, done by Christian Smith, studied 3,700 teenagers throughout the country, a random sample, and found that the highly religious youth in that sample reported the highest quality of parent-child relationships. That adolescent religiosity is inversely related with a number of high-risk behaviors: drug use, suicide, and so forth. Religious involvement, and I mentioned suicide. Religious kids tend to do better in school, are less likely to cut class, have a higher graduation rate. They say that they're more honest and respectful toward their parents, and again, the list goes on and on. So we know that there is a connection between religiosity and a number of benefits in marriage and family. However, much less is known about how and why. How does faith actually work? What are the processes by which religion works in people's lives? And why does religion really matter? So that's the research that I've been involved with in the last number of years, in interviewing Christian, Jewish, and Muslim parents and their adolescent kids, also interviewing a number of rabbis, priests, and imams, and pastors, and bishops, and so forth, from a variety of faith communities, asking about how is it that their religious beliefs and practices make a difference in their marriage and family life. So I'm going to share with you some findings from a number of studies that we've published out of this research. I do qualitative research, and so I go and interview folks, typically in their homes, sometimes in their places of worship. In my case, most of my focus with Friends of Other Faiths has been in New England and Northern California. Spent a 6-month sabbatical in New England, interviewed a number of families there, then spent 7 weeks interviewing families in California. So I'm going to present a few findings from some of the studies that we've done. The sample is 57 married couples and their 77 adolescent children. Most are Caucasian, 16% are racial and ethnic minorities. Most are in their middle years. Most have been married about 20 years or so, with an average of 3 children, a range from 1 to 11 kids. And no, it wasn't an LDS family that had the 11 kids. It was an African-American Muslim family. The youth range from 10 to 20. Mean age was 15. So here's the distribution of the faith communities of folks that I interviewed. I'm now going to talk with you very briefly about a study that my friend and colleague Mike Goodman at the BYU Religion Department and I published on how couples talked about God as an influence in their life. We asked the ways that the interview question was on, in what ways does God influence your marriage, and what ways does God make a difference in your married life. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to share with you a number of quotes from folks I interviewed. In this case, I'm going to just jump right to a conceptual model and just show you and just chat briefly about what we found. Couples talked about, so the point here is that it isn't just that people are religious, it's how they're religious. How does God make a difference? And what we learned is that not everybody thinks about God in the same way. Most of the couples that I interviewed said that God was a meaningful part of their life, and was, in some cases, they talked about him being a kind of a third partner, part of the marital triangle, that he was, a kind of a binding cord in their marriage. But some talked about God as having more of an indirect effect, that his effect in this bottom box here, that really they didn't feel like they had a personal relationship with God, and that wasn't so important to them, but their involvement in their faith community and their attempt to follow the teachings and moral principles of their religion was most important to them. Others in that middle box talked about God as the God of being, that he was an example for them. That, they tried to be like Jesus. He was a source of accountability for them. A number of couples talked about how they felt accountable to God, to be honest with each other, to be faithful to their marital vows, and to be good husbands and wives. They also talked about him as kind of a resource. On occasion, they might turn to God for particular help. Then the highest or the most direct way that God was involved in people's lives, we called it the God of doing, where people talked in great detail about about a very strong relationship that they had with God, about a number of ways in which he answered their prayers and guided and led them through the Holy Spirit and forgiving them, and in a very direct and tangible way was involved in their marriage. The outcomes were that people who said that God was an important part of their marriage talked about that brought them stability and unity. It helped them to overcome challenges and conflict, and I'll talk more about conflict in a few minutes. It helped them to grow in their marriage and helped them to be highly motivated to be the best parents and husbands and wives that they could be. And they talked about the sense of peace and happiness that brought. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that we did on the ways that religion helps couples avoid and resolve marital conflict. I did this research with Nate Lambert, a former undergraduate student here, now a graduate student at Florida State. We found, I'm going to share a couple of quotes in just a minute, but we found in a nutshell that couples talked about how their religion helped them at various stages in the marriage conflict process. A number talked about how they felt that their religious beliefs and practices and involvement in their faith community helped them avoid a number of problems that they might have had without that. Others talked about how either right in the midst of conflict itself, as they were in an argument, let's say, they would remember something that they had read in the Bible or something they'd heard from a religious leader, or they would just remember that this was wrong and they would stop. In some cases, they would actually stop and pray and get direct help in resolving the issue. In cases where the conflict perhaps was not something that was immediately resolved, it was going on in their marriage, they talked, couples would describe how they might be in a church service and hear something and that reminded them that they needed to be more forgiving or more patient or more understanding. And then others talked about how when they had serious conflicts that involved real pain and real difficulty, that God helped them to resolve that and sort of be reconciled, not only with God, but reconciled with their spouse. So here's some quotes. A Baptist social worker, Debbie, and all these names are pseudonyms, in talking about how religion helped to prevent problems, said, "I think that the more shared perspective on life that you have, the less inherent conflicts to begin with. So I think having a shared faith is important in that sense, in both the big picture and hopefully the smaller picture. But I think for me, somehow my faith affects how I view conflict." And by the way, you're probably aware that the research shows that couples who are religious are much less likely to divorce, and that's especially true if they're religious in the same faith and in the same basic way. However, couples that have religious conflict, that are interfaith marriages or significantly different in how they view their faith and how to live it, tend to have a lot of conflicts and a higher divorce rate. Still in the area of problem prevention, Alicia, a Catholic Latino biologist, said that the principle also that we learn from God's message is not to be selfish, be humble, and caring for the other and giving. And one of the messages that I remember they instilled was the other. It's not much about your needs, but what you can do for others. Now, once conflict was actually occurring in the marriage, couples talked about a number of ways that their faith helped them. Alex, a Puerto Rican Pentecostal police officer, said, "A crisis would come. We'd feel that we'd need to pray together. We feel that there's a lack of communication between us. Also, as a matter of fact, that happened recently. So we pray together. When we feel that something is trying to divide, we'll pray together, and it strengthens, or at least alleviates the problem." And in this particular case, Alex and his wife, like a number of couples that I interviewed, said that they either had been in previous marriages that ended because there was no faith involvement and there was nothing to kind of bind them together, and they argued and fought, and there was substance abuse and so forth. And now they were in a second marriage in which they've decided to be serious about their faith. They got religion, so to speak, and a number of couples talked about how much of a difference that made. In this particular case, Alex and his wife had serious marital conflict and were about to divorce and decided to give religion a try. So, one of their friends, encouraged them to make faith an important part of life. They did, and now we're together many years later. In the area of reconciling after significant conflict, Elizabeth, a Lutheran homemaker, said, "Well, I think the one thing that we've decided, that marriage is forever, and no one's leaving, so you're going to have to work this out. We're going to have to come to some agreement because no one's going anywhere. Commitment actually makes us do something about it instead of not dealing with it." And a number of couples talked about how divorce wasn't an option because of their religious vows. And so they were going to work it out, and that made a big difference in their life. Another, Sean, a Baptist University chaplain, said, "Because we receive grace and forgiveness from God, we can extend that to each other. And we also draw upon Him as our resource to be able to live together in a loving, gracious way." And particularly evangelical Christians talked about how their close relationship with God strongly impacted their relationship with each other. But God was not an important part of all people's faith. One Jewish couple that I interviewed, highly religious couple, happily married for 22 years, I asked them how their relationship with God influenced their marriage, and they said it's not an issue. The husband said, "We've been married 22 years and have never had a conversation about God." And his wife said, "Now, honey, wait, there was that time in Ohio when we talked about God." He said, "Yep, that's right, you're right, sorry. We've had one conversation about God." So he's not a factor. It's our traditions, it's our observances, it's our heavy involvement in the Jewish community that have made a difference in our marriage. So people for whom a relationship with God is an important part of their faith, most Christians, don't always understand that it's possible to have a religion benefit you greatly, even though a close relationship with God may not be part of that. I'm going to shift gears for a minute and talk about the interviews I did with parents and their adolescent kids. One of the interesting findings in the social science research is that when you ask young adults who are religious, what was it about their upbringing and what their parents did that made a difference in why they're a religious person. And they do say, well, my parents, they walked the walk. They lived their faith, and that was important. But a lot of youth, a lot of young adults talk about how they sort of took that for granted in some ways. That was their experience and what really made a difference for them was the way that their parents talked with them about faith. And a lot of youth and young adults talk about how if their parents engage them in religious conversations and respect the kids' opinions and don't preach to them and so forth, it makes a real difference. So this study that we did focused on the quality of parent-child conversations about religious issues. I did this research with Jen Thatcher, a former master's student here. So the questions that we asked were, I asked the kids and their parents about 20 questions, some directed to the kids, some to the parents, and we used all of that data. But the main question that I asked was a very direct one. So when you guys talk about religious issues, how does it go? Describe that for me. And it was very interesting to hear how people talked about that. So the research questions were, what is the context of parent-adolescent conversation on religious issues? What are the processes involved in parent-adolescent conversations that involve religion? And what qualities of conversational processes are most beneficial for religious exploration and development of youth? And as I've shared this research with a number of groups, this is one of those things where parents often talk about the struggles and the frustrations that they have with their teenagers, where they feel like that sometimes religion becomes a sensitive issue. Often youth are pushing the boundaries a little bit. They may be raising questions. They may be expressing doubts. And a number of parents talk about sometimes the stressful conversations that they have, the kind of crossroads conversations that they have. And the findings from my research, I think, has some important practical applications for how to talk with teenagers about religious issues. So I asked, like I said, a number of questions, I guess 26 questions on a variety of issues. The ones that were most meaningful for this research was I asked the parents, I asked the youth, how do your parents share their faith with you? I asked, when you talk together about religion, how does it go? And I asked, how have your parent-child conversations about religion influenced both parents and children? I also asked the parents how they, as parents, share their faith with their kids. We also did a little survey where we asked a little 20-item scale called the FAITH scale, Faith Activities in the Home scale, which asked about the frequency in which people participated in a variety of religious issues, studying religious texts together, singing hymns, listening to religious music, religious meals, saying grace at dinner, and a variety of other kinds of religious behaviors. And we found it interesting that families rated religious conversations, of all those possible kinds of ways of sort of doing faith activities in their homes, families rated religious conversations as the most meaningful and the second most frequent after grace at meals, religious activities. And so religious conversations were very important to these people. We found two basic, what we kind of labeled as two basic kinds of religious conversations, what we called parent-centered conversations and what we called youth-centered conversations. This is just a model trying to kind of capture, in one place all the major findings, but I want to particularly focus on this center box here, the youth-centered conversations. This is where the adolescent talked more and the parents listened. The adolescent sought and received understanding from parents, so usually the youth initiated the conversation. The discussions of religion were related to the child's life. It wasn't just sort of abstract. It was a very practical, concrete kind of a conversation. The conversation was open, meaning the youth felt that they were free to talk and to express their honest opinions, even if they didn't completely agree with their parents. And the relationship was nurtured. The kids felt like it wasn't about the parents sort of preaching. It was about building relationships. The parent-centered conversations, as described by both parents and youth, involved the parents talking too much, the parents giving demands without explaining, just do it because I said so. The parents' talk was unsolicited or unwarranted. Sometimes kids talked about how it seemed like every single conversation the parent brought up religion, and that was not nice for them. And the conversation they felt was too restrictive, that it focused only on religious issues and not enough about what the youth considered to be kind of their daily life. And then the outcomes of the kind of influence on the adolescents for the two different kinds of conversations. The youth and the parents mentioned that if the conversations were parent-centered, that the youth were annoyed, mad, uninterested, didn't listen, less likely to initiate conversations in the future. Whereas if the conversations were more youth-centered, the youth said that they were engaged, interested, they enjoyed it, and they were more likely to initiate that type of a conversation later. Now some quotes from youth. This is under the topic of parents talking too much. Chad, a 12-year-old Episcopalian, said, "Sometimes I ask a question and then I think they go too far because they start talking too much. And then I say that I don't want to discuss it anymore and I try to walk away. And then they have me like come back and I'm like really mad." As opposed to youth talking and parent listening more, Rachel, Hasidic Jewish mother, said, we find the older kids get, they have so much to say, and they come home and they don't want to hear us talk, they want to talk. Kira, Lutheran mother, said, "I've learned that less words are better, because sometimes if you just plant the seed, their mind will work on it." Under the heading of parents giving unsolicited or unwanted religious talk to their youth, Haley, a 14-year-old Latter-day Saint, said, "He always, for every situation, even something as a math problem, he can relate a scriptural principle, and it can get really annoying." This particular brother was a religious educator, and not surprising, had a lot to offer. Joanna, 49-year-old African Methodist Episcopal mother, said, "Jasmine just rolls her eyes, and if she just says, 'Mom, I don't want to hear it,' it's like, okay, fine. But meanwhile, I've said it." So she's describing that tension that there sometimes is in parent-youth conversations. As opposed to when the adolescent seeks and receives understanding from their parent. Mandy, a 15-year-old Christian, said, "They're always willing to talk to me about any questions I had, and they explain what they believe to me." Kelsey, a 13-year-old Orthodox Christian, said, "Sometimes my parents don't know the answer, so then it's kind of a discussion because they don't have the answer to give me." The core concept of our research is this: when parent-adolescent religious conversations are youth-centered, the emotional experience is more positive for parents and adolescents than when they're parent-centered. I did ask the question in the interview of the youth. The question went something like this: so as you look down the road and see yourself maybe in 5 or 10 years being married and having your own children, how do you think you're going to do religion in your own home and family? And it was surprising to me how frequently the youth said something like, "Well, actually, I think my parents are doing a great job. They're awesome, and I'm assuming I'm going to just try to do what they've done for me. I'm going to just try to follow their example, and I'll feel lucky if our family is as, my family future is as good as our family is now." And of course, not surprisingly, the parents would sometimes look shocked at that, to hear their youth, complimenting them so, and there were some tears and some hugs and some real appreciation that all the effort that these religious parents were devoting to helping their children learn about their faith and try to live their faith, that in most cases the youth really did appreciate what their parents were doing. Going to shift gears back to talking about marriage for a moment and how religious involvement promotes marital fidelity. I also did this research with Nate Lambert, who was an undergraduate here. There's a lot of research that shows that the more religious couples are, the less likely they are to be unfaithful to each other, to commit adultery. A number of studies have shown that, and so I wanted to find out a little bit more about why. And in this case, I didn't actually ask the question outright about fidelity. In interviewing certain folks of various faiths, that would be an uncomfortable question for them to ask that directly. So I asked questions about, how do you think your religious beliefs and practices influence your marriage? And not surprisingly, a large number of couples talked about fidelity as one of the most important ways. I'm remembering 2 examples in particular. One Catholic guy talked about how, I think I might even have a quote here, how the wedding itself was a really important thing for him. He didn't realize how important taking those vows in a church with the priest and all of his family and friends, and he didn't realize how seriously those vows were going to sort of weigh on him. And he said, and looking over and seeing her 10 brothers there also probably had an effect on my willingness to be faithful to my vows. In essence, the research shows that religious beliefs and practices have the effect of sanctifying the marriage. Research done by Annette Mahoney and her colleagues has shown that even people who aren't particularly religious will use words like holy and sacred to refer to their marriage. And because because religion talks about marriage as ordained of God, most religious people really do take their marital vows seriously. One of the Jewish husbands that I interviewed talked about how when he was, if he found himself straying in his thoughts, looking at another woman or thinking about another woman, he would finger the tzitzit, the part of the garment that Orthodox Jews wear underneath their clothing that reminds them of the Torah, of the commandments. A Muslim husband talked about how he would go to work in the mornings, and often in the mornings a lot of his coworkers, his male coworkers, would be standing at the window on the third or the fourth floor of the opposite building. They would be watching women coming in from their cars into the building, and they'd be commenting on how they looked and making various comments. And he said, I know that Allah is watching, and I'm accountable to Allah, and I cannot do that. So I go over and do my work. So religious beliefs really make a big difference. Religious vows and involvement in the couples that I interviewed, they talked about how it fortified their relational commitment. A number of them mentioned and said something like, we know a lot of people, our friends and coworkers and others, who their marriages have not lasted. And if we didn't take our marital vows seriously, then we would probably be in the same place that they are. Moral values, about people talking about how their beliefs and practices encourage them to really focus on being a good person and being honest and being open and upfront with their spouse, how that increased fidelity. And a number talked about how their strong relationship with God influenced their relationship and their desire to be faithful to their spouse. This model illustrates some of these findings. Under that big, broad area of a sanctified marriage, religious involvement tended to affect couples' relationship in some really important ways. For example, couples talked about how their faith practices gave them a way to spend meaningful time together because they prayed together or read sacred texts together or sang in the choir together or attended services together or did religious services together. That kind of time together was different from simply watching movies or just mundane secular kinds of practices, and so it sanctified their time together. They talked about how their faith gave them a shared sense of purpose and vision for their marriage, enhanced their interpersonal virtues, gave them help in resolving conflict. The research shows that often when infidelity occurs, it's when the marriage relationship breaks down and the couple are really in serious trouble, and then is when infidelity is more likely to happen. And so the fact that the faith helped them resolve conflicts helped them to stay away from the point where they were thinking that they weren't going to stay married or they weren't happy, they needed to look elsewhere. And the divine relational assistance the couples talked about, that there were times that God's Spirit or His grace or His influence helped them to make good decisions and stay faithful in their marriage. I asked youth about the kinds of things that they felt that their religion asked them to sacrifice or asked them to give up. And couples talked about, youth talked about, and their parents talked about a variety of ways that they made important sacrifices for their faith. The research grouped them into 5 basic areas: societal expectations, popular culture, comforts and pleasures, time and activities, and peer relations. Youth talked about how, and it was surprising to me, how many of the youth talked about how their faith gave them a very strong sense of identity. And yes, the Jewish kids talked about how, they wouldn't go to certain parties on Friday evening, or they wouldn't do soccer on Saturday morning because of the Sabbath. LDS kids talked about the word of wisdom and how that made them different, not dating until they were 16. Each of the kids talked about ways in which their faith asked them to do sometimes difficult things that sometimes made them quite different from their peers. Very few talked about that as a problem and an issue. The majority talked about how that gave them a strong sense of personal identity and confidence in their life. And they looked around and they saw their friends falling into various kinds of problems, and they felt that their beliefs and their faith involvement and even those things that they sacrificed helped them avoid a lot of those problems that they saw around them. They felt that their sacrifices helped them connect to a higher meaning or purpose in their life. They felt that their sacrifices helped them to connect to God because they were doing those sacrifices for God. They felt that it helped them connect to their faith tradition, especially Jewish youth talked about this. They talked about how it was important to them that their parents and their youth leaders and their pastors did have expectations for them, and that was meaningful to them, that by being good Jews, good Muslims, good Catholics, good Mormons, that they, part of it, yes, was fulfilling expectations, but they were happy to do that. This idea that adolescents are completely in rebellion, and there's this whole youth culture that is just an absolute rebellion to adults, the research simply doesn't bear that out. Smith's large national study found that the vast majority of kids talk about loving their parents, wanting to obey their parents, wanting to kind of follow along in their parents' footsteps. Of course, the media paints a picture that youth are all about rejecting and rebelling against their parents, but it's simply not the case for the vast majority of youth, although watching the media gives you a very different picture of that. I want to briefly talk about another study that we did where we asked what these families felt that they did to try to fulfill the sacred purposes that they felt that God had for them. This table summarizes in a nutshell our findings that and I'm going to focus on that middle box on family processes. We found a number of processes that families talked about that they tried to do in their families, in their homes, to fulfill the purposes that they felt that God had for their family. They talked about relying on God or God's word for support, guidance, and strength. They talked about sanctifying their family by living their faith at home. And the Abrahamic faiths are certainly people go to mosques and churches and synagogues to worship, but there are many practices, prayer and studying sacred texts and a variety of other kinds of worship practices that folks do in their homes that they feel sanctifies their homes and makes a real difference in their life. They talked about resolving conflict with prayer and repentance and forgiveness. They talked about loving and serving others in their family, in their faith community, and in the wider community. A number of folks told stories about how when they went together as parents and kids to work at a soup kitchen or to help the homeless or to do quilts or to do a variety of other projects intended to bless other people, that made a real difference and helped them in their relationships with each other. They talked about overcoming challenges and trials through shared faith, and every one of these families talked about difficulties that they had at times and how they felt like they would not have made it through those without their faith. They talked about abstaining from prescribed activities and substances. I've mentioned a little bit about this, but sometimes Latter-day Saints feel that we're among the only people that really make a lot of sacrifices, and it simply is not true. Many people in many faiths make significant sacrifices for their faith. And by and large, they tend to feel good about that. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's not always convenient. But people, at least these people that I interview, who are highly religious people, talked about the meaning and the sense of deep purpose and covenant that meant for them. They talked about sacrificing time, money, and comfort and convenience. Talked about nurturing spiritual observance and growth through teaching, through example, through discussion, and how meaningful it was for the parents to be able to share their faith with the kids, and how meaningful the kids talked about how important it was to hear their parents, to see their parents worship, and to hear their parents share their beliefs and their experiences with them. And it was just a delight to sit in people's homes and see the deep connections that go on. And, sure, you can connect in your family on boating trips and going to amusement parks and other kinds of wholesome recreational activities. But there's no substitute for meaningful spiritual and religious joint family and couple activities. They talked about obeying God and prophets, parents and commandments. And I was a little surprised how important obedience was to the youth in particular. A number of kids talked about how they would describe their friends who would lie to their parents or do things behind their parents' back or talk back to their parents. And a number of kids said something like this: "But I can't do that. My faith, my God has asked me to respect and honor my parents, and so I need to tell them the truth. I can't do those things." And the bonding that created was substantial. And a lot of them talked about how they put family and faith ahead of personal and secular interests and how that made a real difference. And a faith community gives you the opportunity to do that. An interesting passage in the Book of Mormon, the prophet Mormon said, "For the eternal purposes of the Lord shall roll on until all his promises shall be fulfilled." At the beginning, I talked about some of the important promises that God has made in the Scriptures, and a little bit about the research, for example, that shows that the word of wisdom is not just a nice idea, but it is empirically, demonstrably, God's promise is real. The destroying angel of cancer and of alcoholism and of violence induced through substance abuse. Many people don't realize that anywhere from 50 to 70% of domestic violence occurs when people are under the influence of substances. And so Latter-day Saints who keep the word of wisdom, for example, are able to avoid the destroying angel of substance abuse and the domestic violence that often occurs under that influence. What I've shared with you is a little bit of summarizing of the research that has demonstrated that the Lord's promise to Abraham that his seed would be a blessing to all the families of the earth has been fulfilled. Families of the Abrahamic faith, the research shows, literally thousands of studies show that their faith does bless them and it blesses others. So, your part in helping bless all the families of the earth. I encourage each of you to strive to bless your own families and to be a blessing to all the families of the earth that you have association with or stewardship for. And that might be in civil or church or family situations. And I encourage you to seek the blessings and the guidance of the Lord for how you can best do this. If you're interested to read any of the publications that I've talked about at my website, which is there for you, there are PDFs of most of these publications, and I invite you to read further if you'd like. Thank you very much.